Hi, my name is Bence and this is the first of a number of mixed media presentations about my new project, which is about mental imagery. So today I'm going to introduce the concept of mental imagery and talk a little bit about how I'm going to be using it and how neuroscientists and psychologists have been using it. And the reason why I chose this format today is in order to be able to run the following example by you. So close your eyes and visualize an apple, which you couldn't do if you were reading this blog entry, because you can't read the blog entry and close your eyes at the same time. And now just kind of pay attention to your experiences then. Now, I want to say that this is undoubtedly one way of exercising your mental imagery, but it's not the only way, and in many ways it's a very atypical way of thinking about mental imagery. So if we want to anchor our concept of mental imagery in something solid, we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't use this example. And I want to say that this example of mental imagery is atypical in 5 different respects. So I want to make 5 distinctions within the category of mental imagery. These are going to be orthogonal to one another, some more interesting than the others. So the first one, which is not very interesting, is that this kind of mental imagery that you have when you close your eyes and visualize an apple is visual mental imagery. Mental imagery can be auditory and tactile and olfactory. Again, not a very interesting distinction. Second distinction is more interesting. It's about the voluntariness of mental imagery. So when you close your eyes and visualize an apple, you count to 3 and you do the visualizing. That's a voluntary act. But mental imagery does not have to be voluntary. So when you have involuntary flashbacks, or in the auditory sense modalities, earworms, those little tunes that go through your head, that's going to be involuntary exercise of mental imagery. So it's the second distinction. The third one is about the spatial features of mental imagery. So when you close your eyes and visualize an apple, this apple is going to be located, presumably, or for most people, in some kind of non-egocentric space. So in this abstract or visualized space where you visualize this apple as being. And there's no fact of the matter about, for example, how far away this visualized apple is from the tip of your nose. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. I can visualize an apple right here in front of me. That would be visualizing it, or that would be an exercise of mental imagery that would visualize the imagined object in one's egocentric space. The fourth distinction is about the feeling of presence. So when you close your eyes and visualize an apple, this mental state is not accompanied by a feeling of presence. You're not somehow fooled into thinking that there's an apple in front of you when you visualize an apple, or you don't feel that it's present. But some other ways of exercising mental imagery, they are different. They are accompanied by a feeling of presence. So dreaming is one example, especially lucid dreaming, where you have mental imagery which is accompanied by a feeling of presence. Now the last example, the last distinction I want to draw within the category of mental imagery can be the most controversial one, and that's about the difference between conscious and unconscious mental imagery. So I want to say that mental imagery can be unconscious. Why? Most mental states can be unconscious, so why could mental imagery be unconscious? That's one reason. The other reason is that mental imagery, as we're going to see, is some kind of perceptual process. And if that's the case, then given that perceptual processes can be conscious or unconscious, then it seems like mental imagery has no reason to be necessarily conscious. But the most important and the most interesting reasons for thinking that mental imagery can be unconscious come from empirical studies, especially of subjects who have a condition that has recently been labeled aphantasia, where they can perform all the behavioral tasks that clearly require mental imagery, but nonetheless they have no phenomenology that would accompany that. Finally, the way psychologists and neuroscientists think about mental imagery, it's clearly as a mental state that may or may not be unconscious. So many of the famous experiments, for example, the mental rotation tasks, they're behavioral experiments that they allegedly tell us various things about mental imagery, but whatever they tell us anything about is going to have to be a mental process that may be conscious or unconscious, because it's really the only hard data we get from this experiment is a timing of our behavior, and it's nothing to do with weather, and whether this performance is accompanied by anything, any kind of phenomenal field. Okay, so I made all these distinctions within the category of mental imagery, but I never said what I mean by mental imagery. And here I want to really piggyback on the psychologist and neuroscientific literature on mental imagery and give it a philosophical twist. So you're going to see a lot of examples for a lot of nice quotes from psychologists and neuroscientists about what they take to be mental imagery. And what I take to be mental imagery is a version of that. So here's my version. Mental imagery is perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in the given sense modality, in the relevant sense modality. So I want to unpack this a little bit. So mental imagery is a kind of perceptual processing, and by perceptual processing, I mean processing in the perceptual system. And of course, that's going to bring in thorny questions about where perceptual system ends and the cognition begins. So in order to bypass that, I just want to take early perceptual processing, the time that we really have no doubts about it, that's going to be perceptual processing. So early cortical processing. So the primary visual cortex in the visual sense modality, maybe the secondary visual cortex, or V4, V8, maybe MT. So if there's perceptual processing there that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in the given sense modality, we have mental imagery. So the other concept I need to specify or need to clarify is the concept of sensory stimulation. By sensory stimulation, I mean an event, the event of the light hitting our retina, in the case of the visual sense modality. So it's not stimulus, which I take to be something that's out there, that's causing the stimulation. By this, I just mean sensory stimulation, which is the event of the sensory organs being activated. So in the visual sense modality, again, what you have then is the sensory stimulation of the sense organ, so light hitting your retina. You have the activation in the early cortical regions, so for example, the primary visual cortex. If the early activation in the primary visual cortex is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in the on the retina, then we're going to have to talk about an instance of mental imagery. So, okay, the final concept that I need to say something more, no, second last concept I need to say something more about is that of corresponding. What does it mean that the perceptual processing is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation? So here I want to take advantage of the fact that some of the early cortical perceptual processing is, in the visual sense modality is retinotopic. Same is true for olfactory and auditory processing. It's a little more complicated, so I want to stick to the visual sense modality. So the primary visual cortex is organized in the same way as the retina. So you're looking at a triangle, and there's a triangle shape on your retina, and something like a triangle shape coded in your primary visual cortex in the same way as the retina. So you have a fairly good way of tracking what's corresponding. Now I take correspondence to be a gradual notion, so it's not as either correspondence or no correspondence. It can be more or less correspondence, and that's going to be important in the next time we're going to talk about this. So that was the second last concept, that of correspondence, and then the last concept is the relevant sense modality. So again, I want to talk about mental imagery, or visual mental imagery in this case. If there's perceptual processing, say in the primary visual cortex, that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation, say in the retina, but it may be triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in a different sense modality, so in the auditory sense modality, for example. And that's going to bring in a lot of cross-modal influences on mental imagery, which is something I'm going to talk about next time. It's really interesting implications of that. Good. Now, you may, at this point, be completely freaked out and think this has nothing to do with philosophy, and because this is just a kind of neuroscientific concept, there's no kind of introspecting verification of this. If I put you in the scanner, I can tell whether you have mental imagery or not, even if you say nothing about it, even if you say if you think otherwise. If you have no sensory stimulation, and you have early cortical processing of something that is not triggered by the sensory stimulation, I'm just going to tell you that you have mental imagery. How crazy is that? So I don't think it's crazy at all. I think this concept, which is really the kind of the psychological and neuroscientific concept is continuous with the philosophical concept, and it can be thought of as some kind of generalization of it. So if you think of mental imagery as perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in a given sense modality, and one nice feature of this is that this is going to include all those instances of mental imagery that we talked about at the beginning, so like closing your eyes and visualizing an apple. But it's also going to include more. So it's going to be a very large category, which is going to include a lot of really exciting mental phenomena, and I think we can have some kind of explanatory benefit from treating them as one big category and making these distinctions that I talked about in the first half of the talk before. So, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your comments, and I'm going to talk about the relation between mental imagery and everyday perception next time. Thank you.